Okay. Welcome everyone to the TST meeting. It's April 12th, and we don't have any formal items on the agenda, which means you guys can come up with some, or it'll be a short meeting. But before we get there, a couple of points. The first is this is the first TST meeting that we've held since the recent election, and we'd like to welcome David Bainbridge and Yuta Tachi. Yeah, sorry, Yuta. To the TST.
He's not here. We can call him whatever we want.
Yep, exactly.
Anyway, and there's also some shout-outs that I'd like to call out. In chronological order, this is Sithara and Gaurav and the rest of their team at Huawei who kind of pulled together the dynamic config Yang toolchain and dynamic config system for the ONOS demo. Stephen, who's helping out with the UI and doing some good work there.
A lot of appreciation on that. I see a lot of exclamation points.
Yeah.
So you must be doing good work.
Jianhao for the MCORD stuff. Luca, who's been working with a few folks, including Yi, on the Northbound Brigade. And William Quivinger for his work on the ONOS mini summit at ONS, as well as all the speakers who took some time to prepare talks for the mini summit. So that sort of ends our agenda.
Well, there's also the meta shout out.
Yeah, you can shout out.
The meta
first one.
Oh, yes, the meta shout out. To everyone who gave a shout out to other people who gave a shout out.
I'd like to wish those people too.
Yeah, so those people earned ONOS hoodies. So you may have seen I was promoting kind of the encouragement of people to use the acknowledgement page all throughout March, and those were the people who actually did the shout out. So I'm trying to figure out how to make the recognition happen more regularly. So please, as a reminder, I won't necessarily give away free hoodies all the time, but when you do see somebody doing something good, some good work, remember to make use of that acknowledgement page, and I'll try to send reminders about it regularly as well.
Wait, David, did you say something about free goodies? What are these?
Hoodies.
Oh, free hoodies.
All the extra sweatshirts.
Oh, hoodies. What?
And a meta shout out to David for
wheels of community communication.
Exactly. Thank you, David.
Sure.
Looks like we've added David Bainbridge here. You missed your welcome shout out, David.
Yeah, I was under the impression that we weren't going to have this today, so glad I joined it late anyway.
Yay, David.
Okay, well,
actually, that's a good question. It is on the ONOS community calendar, right?
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah.
So we didn't have any formal agenda item or presentation for today. However, we thought it might be useful to have the meeting anyway, in case there were items that people in the room or online were interested in discussing.
I was wondering if we could maybe pick up some of the threads of the engineering meeting that we had earlier, because I felt like there was a lot of discussion that a lot more could have been said, but we ran out of time, or with I forget the exact point, but I know that Bob was talking about some of that stuff. So I don't know
about like the hallway conversation.
Yeah, I don't know if it's the right venue for that, but
Okay.
So unless are there any things?
Well, I meant more. I guess I meant more on, the where ONOS is and ONOS and Cord are and where we're going. We're talking about reconsidering the roadmap, or how do we think about the roadmap in light of what we learned. That's kind of triggered my suggestion.
I guess one interesting thing to consider is, are we working on the right things? And, given that ONOS has very limited resources, especially in ON.Lab, are we doing the right thing with those? And then there's also something I was talking with people about today, like with Brian and Ray, about the build infrastructure, like how important. It seems there are lots of ways that it could be improved, and this would certainly have a high payoff. But the question is, how much time do we want to spend working on it, and if anybody wants to do that, or does nobody want to do it, and we'll just let it continue to be the way it is today. But
well, I mean, there's some interesting threads, right? Like, I mean, one is sort of ON.Lab and how ON.Lab wants to participate in the ONOS project and community. This probably isn't the right venue for that conversation. Now, the conversation about sort of initiatives that the project can take or potential opportunities that the project might find valuable in light of ONS or sort of any other discussion, really, this might be a good venue for. So, I mean, in particular, if there are specific opportunities that you had or people in the room have or people online have about features or directions or whatever, I mean, we could potentially have that conversation.
actually, one thing I thought I'd mention that perhaps would be relevant to TST is that and David might be interested as well, is that I actually met up in person with Elena and Emerson, who were part of the kind of previous sort of informal documentation brigade, and they actually tracked me down somehow, or they recognized my voice or something and found me. They're like, "Hey, Bob," and so they grabbed me and we talked for like an hour and a half, and it was really kind of interesting that they basically are sort of willing and interested in helping out with ONOS documentation, but they are currently sort of disempowered from doing so because the sort of I guess learning curve and startup cost of doing documentation and figuring out the system without having any base documentation means that you sort of just have to read the code in order to figure out how the system works. And so that was an interesting example of having people who would like to contribute, but the project having a large barrier that sort of prevents their contribution to the project. And historically, we as the ONOS project have decided to sort of deprioritize documentation and say that it's something that the core ONOS team is not going to work on, and it's sort of a community opportunity. And so I don't know, I thought I'd just sort of mention that and say that, there are people who'd like to work on documentation, but currently, since we've deprioritized it, there's no way for them to do so.
So, I mean, do you have is the action item here that some amount of sort of system documentation or tutorials or something needs to be built by developers more than we already have to sort of enable these folks, or?
Well, I'm not sure, but currently they're not enabled, and so we're sort of at this interesting situation where people would like to participate in the project, but they sort of can't because they can't bootstrap themselves. And I guess another thing to think of, like, well, they could use help, but then who do we have who would help them out? Probably nobody. So it's an interesting position to be in, and I thought I'd just mention that because I had sort of, we'd been having this informal documentation effort for a while, but then when Ayaka left for Big Switch, that ended. And actually, the meeting sort of ended before then because she was sort of on her way out, I think. So I guess my thought for TST, my question is, how important is documentation, and what do you see as the way forward for that happening? And is there a way that that people who are interested, like Elena and Emerson, can participate? Do you see like a path forward for that, or are we just going to continue to punt it and say that if you want to do documentation, you're completely on your own and just go out and read the code and figure it out?
Just from a focus point of view, are we talking more operator or end user documentation, or module developer documentation? Where do you see that focus?
Yeah. So in particular, usually the ONOS. So we've, like Luca has done some work on this recently on the ONOS so basically on the ONOS administrator guide and developer guide, but also, so really both, documentation for users of the system, which is to say operators, system managers, system administrators, people who are deploying, installing, and running the system and debugging it figuring out, troubleshooting it. and also people who are, and I guess other classes of developers as well, which is to say, people who are developing applications to support use cases on ONOS, as well as core system developers. And I would say that, in general, the sort of kind of Javadoc level documentation is not so bad, and we have some architecture documentation. On the other hand, it seems like I mean, certainly in documentation, kind of previous working group, we identified a lot of things that, you know, were incorrect or out of date or just sort of missing. But I don't know. I mean, I guess that's another thing. People, you know, maybe everybody thinks the documentation is a perfectly okay state and we don't need to do anything to it.
Well, I think it depends on the goals, right? If the goal is to have people other than, I'll call them SDN developers, use ONOS, I think you need some level of operator documentation. They're not going to want to read the code. They want to know how to use the tool.
Yeah, I think so too. My thought is that, I mean, what Bill and others have pointed out is that, you know, it seems that this is we're in this position where we'd like to sort of have some real deployments of ONOS in 2017 in kind of the real world. And so in order for that to happen, it seems documentation can help. It also seems that if there isn't any documentation, then the support burden on people in the project can increase in a way that we may not like. So yeah, so I think a little bit of both. And I also think that in my own experience working on documentation, this sort of ties into one of the themes of ONS as well, is that the user-facing surface of ONOS is very unwieldy. It's kind of not user-friendly. It's like everything with it is hard, you know, from the build system to using an IDE to installing it to deploying it to configuring it, everything. And I really believe that one of the greatest barriers to ONOS adoption is this kind of user hostile facing sort of interface in all aspects. And you know, part of that may be because we're concentrating on core functionality of the system. And of course, some of it's, you know, like, you know, I'm looking at Simon, like the GUI stuff is actually improved greatly. But unfortunately, to get to the point where you can use the GUI is a super pain, as you well know.
To address the point of having no documentation or no foothold for external members, maybe we should suggest that even if you don't, you know, write full sentences, you know, the developers who are working on a particular system at least give some kind of bullet point skeleton of the subsystems to give, you know, a vague navigation for people who want to actually wordsmith usable documentation.
Where would that documentation live?
Wiki.
Because one of the big problems with the wiki is that it falls out of date. It's impossible to keep it synced with the code.
I mean, maybe
Perpetual problem with documentation in general, right? So
maybe I was going to say maybe a bullet point skeletal outline might be at the top level of in source control at the top level of a module, right? Just kind of points that you draw out without having to go digging into the code to figure things out. Almost like a top level README doc or something. And I would propose just text.
Yeah, I like that. I sort of like that idea. I mean, it may or may not be a high priority thing. I mean, previously, I think we suggested something similar that when code's contributed, we also ask for sort of minimal, like skeletal, you know, like some sort of README that will help people write documentation on the system in long form. And to address your point, Brian, of the wiki falling out of sync with the code, I mean, that's a perpetual problem with all projects. And so, you know, for example, I just was looking at the, you know, David Pogue's missing manual series for iOS, and you know, he writes it out of sync with the with Apple's releasing, and Apple doesn't, you know, won't stop their releases in order so that the book can be published. But the book is still useful, extremely useful actually, and even if it lags the actual system by some amount of time, and it doesn't have to be perfect, but having it is certainly better than not having it. Hence the missing manual thing.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my point is that you know, there are some subsystems in ONOS that evolve and are still evolving and have been, you know, evolving fairly rapidly. And so the question is, it's almost worse in my mind to have out-of-date documentation or documentation that's not explicitly synced to a version of ONOS, because then people follow the documentation and don't get an expected result.
Well, I mean, at least they have something to start with rather than just having to build everything from scratch. I'd say having something to start with is better than having nothing at all.
Well, it depends on the size of the change too. I mean, but again, I think what Brian said is, in sync with the release. We have set releases of ONOS, whether we call that a major version or whatever. We could kind of say, look, we're going to focus documentation on a 1.8 release, and when you go to the documentation, you have a little version flag or whatever. It says, what version do I want? And therefore, if you're at version 2.0, you may not have the most up-to-date document. We might not even have any documentation for that, but you can go back to the 1.8. But if the commands have drastically changed, depending on how big this evolution is from one version to the other, it could cause confusion. I think the key is going to be letting people know that this is associated with version X, and if you're using version Y, all bets are off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I don't want to totally derail the meeting towards discussion documentation, but that's just something I ran into, which I thought was interesting at ONS, because I actually met people in person. I mean, in fact, that was kind of the coolest thing about ONS for me, at least, and I think perhaps for many people, is kind of meeting with people in person that otherwise you would just interact with over email or forums or mailing lists, whatever, Slack, and so that was neat to see them, to meet up with them. And yeah, I think the idea of writing documentation that actually matches the explicit version. I also think that you can have development documentation which may or may not be accurate, but at least you have something, which is often better than nothing, even if it's not exactly right. But I think in general, what I think would really benefit the ONOS project, and documentation is part of it, is just if we can make it as easy as possible to install, deploy, install, operate the system, as well as develop on it. And some of that is really just changing the way the system works. I mean, one of my biggest challenges with ONOS.py was all the things that can go wrong with ONOS startup, and all the things I had to check, and all the different failure conditions, and the fact that it would fail all the time and often wouldn't come up, and often was really slow. All these things. If ONOS itself didn't have those problems, my job would have been a whole lot easier. And also, for that matter, ONOS.py wouldn't have been as necessary in some sense, because the system, ONOS.py's job is to absorb all this pain and suffering that otherwise would be foisted upon the end user. And the origin of the pain and suffering is ONOS itself, and its configuration system, and its unreliability, and its kind of low startup performance, and the way it gets out of sync and doesn't start up correctly, and all these various sorts of problems with the system, and also lack of documentation. That's sort of another thing, is that writing ONOS.py, once again, I had to reverse engineer the system. But the documentation is at a better state than it was then, partially because I just put the knowledge that I had learned from reverse engineering the system into the documentation. But the interesting thing is that I don't know if that's correct. I just, this is what I figured out that's worked. It's not necessarily what was intended by the designers of the system. So I think having some insight into the intent of the system designers and implementers is really valuable in something like a README. And I've seen stuff like that in the Linux source space. And so I think, yeah, text in the source tree is a good idea when it makes sense. It doesn't have to be everywhere, but it can add value for sure.
Yeah, and I actually wanted to express my support for that too. I think part of the reason that documentation gets really out of sync is in a place like Confluence, when somebody updates the source code, nobody goes and looks at Confluence to try to figure out what documentation needs to be updated. But if we have at least some documentation in source control, I think it's probably more likely that people will pay attention to it.
Okay. Yeah. I tend to agree with that. And I don't know. I mean, maybe we can take it as an action item to see if we can come up with some recommendations, or someone could take a lead on coming up with some recommendations for.
So I just sketched out a note to myself to add to the top level of web GUI the files readme.user.txt, readme.dev.txt, readme.arch.txt, just as 3 different viewpoints, and in there express, how to use the UI from sitting down and looking at it versus how to add stuff to the UI versus kind of architectural principles for example, in there would be the extensibility and the registration mechanism.
I wonder if it becomes the role or the responsibility of the module owners to at least start those 3 or 4 readmes,
right.
And then as part of the review and check-in process, understand if those need updated.
Yeah. I also threw in a .misc because I might have some thoughts that I want to get captured, but that I don't know where to put them yet. So, but I guess that's kind of optional.
It's not my goal to increase the burden on people and make life worse, but might be worth thinking about.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good idea, which is why I want to push forward with it.
Cool. All right. So yeah, maybe see how that goes, and we can take a look at it. And if we decide this model is something we want to adopt, then
right.
we can potentially enlist our module owners to try to tackle more of this. At least to bootstrap it, and then from there,
right, exactly.
be up to part of the review process would be to.
Well, and also I think for myself when I'm developing code, I think it is helpful sometimes to take a step back and kind of review what are the goals of what I'm writing, and because then sometimes you can figure out, oh well, it doesn't make sense to kind of go down that rat hole because it's not really related to the top level goals. So, constant review is good, I think.
And one other tool we might want to look at here is the Getbook stuff, particularly for keeping this documentation in Git already. If we comply with kind of that process, it might be that we can use the build system effectively to build the final documentation as well.
Yeah, advantages and disadvantages, but yeah, I think it's something to. Actually, I don't know, but yeah, I like the idea of something that has a really user-friendly front end, like the wiki, but is perhaps backed by version control. That seems like a neat idea. Because the idea is that you make it as easy as possible for people to contribute to the documentation, like in context, but at the same time, if it's version controlled, then it can be synced to a release, which is nice.
So, I mean, yeah, I guess some of these tools perhaps are not, super end user friendly or non, source control folk friendly, but I mean, it's easy enough in GitHub to click on, edit this page and do some stuff, and it'll create like a pull request or something. Now, that's not quite as easy as editing in the wiki. And maybe you want something closer to like a Google Docs experience, but.
Yeah, I mean, I like the way for example, the GitHub wikis work, which is that it's a wiki, you click edit, you do it, but it's also back to its database is Git, basically. So you can check it out, you can version control it. People have other stuff, like topics that they wanted to discuss around. I also have lots of questions I could ask TS2, but I don't want to waste your time. I can also just ask Ryan.
At some point, I want to start a discussion around what I call process disaggregation of ONOS. But that's probably a longer-term discussion. But
you mean like splitting ONOS into having it so that it doesn't live in just a single JVM?
Yes.
I think that's something to think about as the system evolves. Another thing I think we want to see happen is splitting up the source tree, not quite as monolithic, and so that people can make progress sort of independently. And I mean, I think there may be growing consensus that the current ONOS, monolithic, all of our eggs in one basket source tree system is kind of unwieldy and can sort of result in process problems. And if we look at the way other platforms work and the way, say, server operating systems work, is that they tend to separate these things out. There's like a kernel, the core system. There's sort of like libraries, these frameworks that are added upon it that are then in turn used by sort of applications, and even applications are sometimes divided into like system applications, which are shipped as part of the distribution, and sort of other extra bonus applications, which can be, which are maybe available through the distribution, but are sort of independently maintained.
And I think what you might see is some of those source tree disaggregation flow around the same boundaries as process disaggregation as well, or at least in some places.
Yeah, possibly. Yeah, I mean, I've been highly critical of various, or I've sort of been vocal about, problems that, Java giveth and Java taketh away. And one of the problems where Java/Carafe taketh away is that all your eggs are in one basket and you have a single process, you have a single JVM that just gets bigger and bigger over time. And that doesn't have necessarily isolation between its subcomponents in terms of either computation or memory, although I think memory you can isolate, but computation is something most JVMs can't do adequately, with few exceptions. Like IBM had their own JVM that had CPU isolation, which is nice, but it didn't make it into Oracle's JVM or OpenCPK.
Okay. Well, do we want to try to tackle one of these two topics at the moment, or do we want to sort of assign someone to prepare some material on them, some background as well as a straw man proposal that could be debated?
The one question I have first is source tree disaggregation. I thought a couple people have mentioned to me already that it's being considered or being started or has at least been talked about. Is that true or not true?
The discussions have happened largely in an ad hoc fashion. It may or may not have appeared on some planning slides or roadmap stuff. There's a couple different people who have been thinking about it in, I think, slightly different ways. There's a whole host of questions around, I think the Cord project is kind of gone, all in on this, and they use repo to manage the multi-repository workspace model. There would probably need to be a little bit of consideration, to making sure we do this appropriately in ONOS. And then the other questions are around, like, in terms of testing and build tooling, just kind of going through what would be required for accomplishing the source tree disaggregation in a sort of minimally evasive way.
All right.
So yeah, I think, there's been a lot of conversation, but there hasn't been a concrete proposal yet. I think there's a lot of people that think it's a good idea, but if we had an explicit proposal that someone worked on, it would be sort of easier to ground some debate, I think. So I think there's probably a lot that could be learned from Cord's experiences, and so perhaps pulling someone in from that group that's been intimately involved could be useful.
I'll take a stab at the first one since I brought it up, the process disaggregation. At least put some bullet points around what's driving my thought processes in this area.
Okay, yeah, and then maybe we could, just pick a CST meeting in the future and put it on the schedule when you're ready. Okay, and I guess for the latter topic, there's a build and packaging brigade that is being formed.
Oh, really?
The work week is happening not next week, but the following week. I think the last week of April. So maybe we can see if there's someone from that brigade that would be interested in sort of leading the proposal on this effort. So maybe we kind of kick this can down the road a bit, and I'll be involved in the work week for that brigade. So I can make sure that this sort of topic comes up and, you know, eventually streams back to a TST discussion. So I can put my name on it for now.
And when we talk about this source tree disaggregation, we're just talking about ONOS core, right? Because there is already separate repos for like Yang and samples.
Yeah, so the question would be, you know, we took some code and put it off in Yang, some code and put it off in app samples. Some apps live in the main source tree. Some have been pulled out and put into core repos. And I think the real question here is, you know, when you're thinking about building a distribution, well, a distribution is a collection of modules or components. And so, you know, if an app wants to evolve sort of separately, skip a release or, you know, release more frequently, it should theoretically be allowed to do that. Then from a distribution perspective, it's like, okay, well, what are the pieces that get pulled together for distribution? So how is a workspace or a distribution defined? Someone that wants to work on a small component of it, how do they build and develop that against the release artifacts that they're depending on, or how do they sort of work on source dependencies?
I guess it's more to what Bob said about, you know, a operating distribution. You've got the kernel, which is essentially the piece that without which it would be an operating system. Mm-hmm. But thereafter, everything else is just modular pieces that you opt in to for the distribution, right? Yep,
and I think, you know, it's one of these things where, I don't know, maybe the version number of ONOS changes to like the kind of Ubuntu model where we have, you know, 1703 and 1706 and 1709 and 1712 or something, where we kind of, the distribution is just more of a timestamp where we're collecting components and we let the versions for various components evolve as it makes sense for the components. Right. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's a lot I think that can be discussed around that. But yes, disaggregation in the sense of, you know, having a disaggregation that makes sense from a sort of per project unit perspective, because even like ONOS app samples, it's not really like a coherent project, but that was just like a bunch of apps that someone wanted some hosting for that we put in a repo. So anyway.
Do you want to mention, like, this is the first I've heard about the build brigade. Do you want to just say a little bit about, like, you know, why the build brigade and what you think, or what the idea is that you could do in a couple weeks?
Yeah, sure. So I can share two things. One is this document.
Oh, okay, it's just under brigade.
So there's a wiki page that describes the brigade. It's going to be led by a guy named Vishwa, who's working for Verizon in India, and there's a few folks that are interested, including Zach, who's been working on Cord. But yeah, the scope, you know, I guess you guys can read this in your own time, but it'll be to make sure that, you know, we can build ONOS efficiently and publish artifacts, and part of this, you know, also works into you know, maintaining the integrity of the code base and stuff. As far as the work week goes, there is a proposal for a tentative plan, which I'll slide over here as well.
Oh, wow.
So, where's
Palm obsolescence,
yeah,
music to my ears.
So some of the topics are, you know, deep dive into Buck, you know, overview of Maven Buck, overview of Jenkins, actually Getbook documentation is on here. Talk about the build and package infrastructure that we have today. Possibly, you know, deep dive into pipeline and how we can leverage pipeline to parallelize some of the build processes, and then sort of planning and governance type stuff. Code-based disaggregation is already on this as well. So.
Oh, interesting.
So yeah, I guess this work week is sort of coming together, and you know, there's some foreshadowing, I guess, to some of the topics, at least around code-based segregation, that were already briefly mentioned. Anyway.
Oh yeah, interesting. Is that schedule linked from the wiki document?
I'm not sure.
Or is there a wiki page for the worksheet week, or it's just not yet, I guess?
I'm not sure where that scheduled, if it's on here yet, to be honest.
Okay, so it might be later.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Oh, okay.
Well, yeah, I can ask Bishwa to publish it somewhere. But if there are specific interests, I guess it might be useful to, if there are specific areas, it would be good to have this published, because if there's specific areas of interest, people could dial in or participate in those specific areas. Cool. Any other topics to either discuss or to put on the pending topics list?
I like the idea of thinking about, you know, look, if people have ideas of, you know, I like the upcoming topics idea, that if people think there's additional upcoming topics that we should, you know, that maybe we have put off or haven't talked about yet, or will be important to talk about in the future, whatever those might be, if people have any other thoughts. I don't actually, well, I have some thoughts, but none that are well-formed enough to actually make a coherent proposal at the moment.
I have a minor point that David B is still ambiguous. You have Boswell and Bainbridge.
Oh, yes. Would you like to alias yourself in some way, or just use your full name, David?
Whatever you choose will work.
Do you have a cool code name or?
I don't have a super identity or secret identity. I'm sorry.
David the Batman Bainbridge.
Yeah, we lost Ali the bomb.
Yeah. Moment of silence for our dear departed Ali. But the great thing is that, well, not that he will necessarily, but the nice thing is that open source projects transcend all boundaries, so everyone is always a member of the ONOS project, at least as long as they want to, which Ali may or may not want to be. But
all right. Well, I think if that's it, then we can probably call this meeting to a close. And the next scheduled meeting is next Wednesday at 4 p.m. So we'll see you then.
Right. Bye.
Thanks.
all right, thanks all.